the website in the chat, so you guys can go there for all the information you need.
Perfect. So the website is done, and I should have known that it was done because Mandy was on it. So it's up, it's running. You have that in the chat. So Mandy, thank you for getting that done. This has been such a great and fun process, but we've been building the ship as we've been sailing it since we started this in January. And so, but my goal is to make sure we get content to you, and we didn't want to wait. So there we are. That being said, I'm going to get out of the way. Mandy, post that one more time based on the comments. Thanks, Ruth Ann. It is my honor and pleasure to present a friend and colleague, Dr. Michael Benitez. I'm not going to go too much into his bio because he's one of the people who I want you to, if you've ever heard of the term local legend, right? He's here locally right now. But I want you to go, when you get a chance after you hear him speak, and go Google him, go check him out at Metro's website and all the different things that he's done. You know, been in higher education, has been all over the country, spoke all over the country, the world, has done some really tremendous work and just tremendous contributions to the academy. But most importantly, he's on the ground. He's with us. You know, we're in the work, we're in the trenches getting it done, and just has a really interesting perspective, hard-hitting, honest, factual research. Just a great resource to have in Colorado and close to us. So I am just honored and privileged to share this space with you, Dr. B. Thank you so much for making the time to be here with my colleagues in the Colorado Community College system. I'm going to get out of the way. The floor is yours. But again, welcome, and thank you again for being here.
Hey, right on, Dr. Ross, my brother. I appreciate you so much. You know what's wild? What's wild, if y'all allow me to just be me, you know, because I don't know how to show up any other way. I try to be fake, man. It didn't work. It's that everything that Dr. Ross just said about me is also true about him. So, brother, appreciating you and everything that you do, and it's a treat to be on the ground, building, amplifying, cultivating, making it happen, and being about that day-to-day grind. And you know, thank you for that nice intro. And when you think about community colleges, community colleges makes it. Let me be clear: community colleges make society run. Right? There's no ifs and buts. Like community colleges, even when you look at some of that data, produce some of the highest numbers of economic contributors to our society. Whether students are graduating in 2 years and moving on to do big things in the workplace, whether students are advancing on to complete 4-year degrees, whether students are elevating themselves and going beyond that to go to graduate studies and eventually end up with terminal degrees. Communities, colleges are really about that underground work and meeting the students where they're at. And so I really love and appreciate working with community colleges. And it's a big reason of why I came here to MSU Denver, is because, I've been at all these institutions for a minute, private schools or state, but they're really state related, quasi-private. For those of you familiar with the politics, you know exactly what I'm referring to. But to come to a place where not only do I see myself reflected and see myself in the faces and the experiences and the subjectivities of the students is truly dope. The last time that I saw that was when I was a student with TRIO, and I was at Penn State. Now at Penn State, I didn't see that, but TRIO, I saw it, right? Anyone that I spoke to, connected with, we were able to vibe at some level of struggle, whether it was another BIPOC person, whether it was another person who came from humble backgrounds and economic means, and those financial struggles of coming up, whether it was, someone who experienced homelessness. At one time in my life, I was homeless for 1.5 to 2 years, from shelter to shelter, until my mom qualified for Section 8. And then we finally, we're able to have an apartment of sorts. And so thank you all for having me. Thank you all for trusting me with your time. I'm about to put up a presentation here in a little bit because it's my pedagogic style. I'm rarely going to speak from the PowerPoint, but I have found, especially in the virtual world, that the PowerPoint serves as a nice supplement to the speaking folks can go back to the PowerPoint and put one-on-one together. Some folks learn better with a visual because there's always so much content to cover. So I'll stay there at that. I'll start by officially introducing myself. Usa Wayu Watiao Didi, Mike Benitez of Afro-Taino descent, to the Cheyenne and Arapaho people and some of the other nations that share this land. I want to say gratitude for allowing me, permitting me to be here, and I want to acknowledge that I am on your ancestral land and your land at this moment. It's always so important for me, and for those of you who perhaps have Native backgrounds, you kind of know that it's also important to not only recognize the land, but to also ask permission often of elders to be able to share the space, share the floor, and take on and address the floor. It's a cultural, a relevant practice, right? And so that's so important. With that said, let me go ahead, put this presentation up. I am going to, I'll just say something before I get going, and that is, I'm going to have y'all engaged. There's going to be some times where I'm going to ask you to engage with me. I welcome you to, I encourage you to, be completely, authentic and honest. And at the same time, I really hope that y'all use that chat and do it up and put some of that commentary there, supplement what I'm saying. I know I got a lot to offer, but I also always have a lot to learn. There's this great quote. It's called the more I learn, the less I know. It's this real dope cat. His name is Mike Benitez. It really speaks to diversity, equity, and inclusion work, right? The more we learn, the less we know. It's like doors just open up when we see that we're learning so much, and then we find out there's so much we don't know, and we could go down so many rabbit holes, and we have to kind of show up with that open mind, especially with critical understandings around cultural relevance, cultural pedagogy, racial equity work. We're really tapping the surface of racial equity, anti-racist work, and are nowhere near what that outcome should look like at the end of the road, and the type of praxis that it takes to actually get there, which creates a tension because it creates a situation where we truly have to wrestle with things like power and positionality. And so rarely do we talk about power and positionality. And we're always down to get down until we hit those two things, power and positionality. Instead of looking at this work as sharing power, we see it as giving up power. Instead of looking at this work as leveraging our positionality as agency to make room for voices to be present and inform the conversation, when we do this work, we create such a competitive, unnecessary spirit that people think that we're trying to kind of stump on one another, as opposed to truly collaborating with one another. Because you know what? It's not about us. It's not about it's not about us by way of how we think and what we think is right. It's about our students. And so how do we put a large part of us in our pocket, allow it to inform us, but still make sure that it's about the students, that we're meeting their needs, assuring that they're getting through, assuring that they're getting the support and the resources that they need in particular. So let me share this screen, make sure that I am doing it right. And then I'm going to ask Joseph, if you could just, by way of head nod, do y'all see that presentation? Excellent. So thank you all very, very much. And yeah, let's get this popping and on the road. So you're going to find me to be incredibly, as Dr. Ross said, unconventional. I've been in higher ed like that my whole life. And so just picture me in a trustee meeting. That's always a good view. So let's begin here. Let's start with setting the flow. All right. We are going to discuss some difficult topics. So, if I ask you to share out, focus on you, focus on the self. Don't hesitate to self-implicate and trust the space. Respect each other, each of what we bring to the table. Those subjectivities are valuable, they matter, and we need to be able to put them in conversation with each other. Respect the mic. Usually this is not an issue in the virtual world, although sometimes you have some people who are trying to like raise their hands or talk. So I still like to put it, maybe I should say respect the virtual mic. You know, this is twofold, challenge the idea, not the person. However, let me be very clear that at times, if the idea comes from a person in a position of power and positionality who's actually passing inequitable policies, then it's not just about the idea, it's also about the person, right? That piece is so important and so hard for folks to walk away with at times. Trust the space. Be mindful about who bears the brunt of injustice. This is, you know, a guideline that I don't think we put out there enough. We don't, you know, when we're talking about, for example, gender violence, we could have a civil conversation, but let's be incredibly clear about who's going to be triggered by way of trauma and subjectivities in those conversations, even when the dialogue is civil. Right. And the same thing with BIPOC. When we talk about some of the fatalities, the deaths, the murders that we're seeing, and, you know, unfortunately, what we saw recently in Atlanta, and then, you know, it killed my spirit to also see what just unfolded at Boulder. It's just so hard. And I, you know, my heart goes out to all the family members and all the loved ones of everyone who has been impacted as of recently because of those strategies. Again, let's be mindful about who bears the brunt of injustice. At least in my sessions, I always like to say emotions are welcomed. You know, sometimes we show up in the spaces like, don't show emotion, be positivist, be objective. You know, you gotta stay grounded. Look, my emotions is what grounds me. It doesn't mean, right, like if I get a little upset or a little sad, it's the authentic me. To suppress that is not to be authentic or show up authentically in a space. And then lastly, language and intent matter. So the way that we say something matters. Let me give you, I always like to give this example because I ran into a situation about 4 years ago where I was in a civil dialogue with a peer, and, you know, the conversation was immigration. And it was under the Trump administration. And so it was a heated debate, right? A pro-anti sort of a back and forth. But I had to remind this gentleman that, you know, hey, I may show up civically and I'm going to listen to you because it's part of what we do. This is higher ed. And I hope you do the same thing, but please know that the moment that you're telling me, even in the nicest of ways, that if I was gone tomorrow, you're okay with that? If I was taken away tomorrow or die tomorrow because you believe in something that eventually, if you connect the dots, leads to my invisibility and absence, I'll hear you when necessary, but I can't hang with you. You know, I'm not, you know what I mean? This is not a cancel culture. It's the reality that you just kind of let me know that if something was to happen to me tomorrow because of my identities, you will not advocate for me. And so, right, we make choices, and I'm going to make a choice unless I need to not hang out with you because I don't know if I could kick it with somebody who is going to let me die, right? To put it in very blunt terms. Also, let's address this as part of the upfront. When honest meets nice. Now, I always like to tell this one with a story before we get into the meat here, and that is, you know, we always hear about nice, right? Every region of the United States has a nice. You have like the Northwest nice, you have the Midwest nice, you know, you have like the Cali laid back, you have Southern hospitality. Now, except the Northeast. The Northeast has like nothing nice of a descriptor about them. You know, I'm from New York. I see it. We're just dead up. It's like, I can't stand you. I can't stand you. I disagree. Okay, let's go enjoy a drink. End of the night. You know, we just kind of tell it like it is. We don't take it personal. Then I went to the Midwest, and I was like, okay, people say folks in the Midwest are nice. And what I found out is that folks in the Midwest are nice until you disagree with them, generally, the culture, and then passive aggression turns into aggressive passive aggression. They aggressively let you know that they're being passive aggressive, right? It's an interesting mix. Now the Northwest has this real nice culture, but it's a very adverse culture. But people there are truly nice. They're so nice that I remember when I got there in my dean and CDO position that's 8 years ago now, but that's how vivid I remember. I was walking along the sidewalk, boom, minding my biz. I'm actually going home from work because I lived about 4 blocks from where I worked, from my office. And there's this car, and the person who's driving the car is doing all these hand gestures, right? And as I'm watching this person slow down, come up on the 4-way intersection that I stopped before I crossed, I was like, damn, right? And that's the trauma setting in. I was like, here we go again. Somebody's gonna put their middle finger out the window, or they're gonna scream out an epithet, and they're gonna drive off. And it's unfortunate that when we have to think that a car slowing down means somebody's gonna do that. Right. And so the more the car gets closer, the more I see these hand gestures. And now I'm like, okay, maybe it's somebody that's not going to act the fool. Maybe that person is just listening to whatever's the newest dopest beat. And so they're just bumping in the car, and they just really, I'm like, man, whatever they're listening to, I want to listen to. But then as the car got closer and actually stopped, I saw that what they were doing was they were taking their hand from right to left as if to say, hurry up, cross. I'm slowing down so you could cross. Like, hurry up, right? Now, look, I didn't have the right of way, right? I'm not used to stopping. If I don't have the right of way, I don't just cross. In New York, if you don't have the right of way and you try to cross, you're going to get hit by a car. Actually, in New York, if you have the right of way, there's a good chance you will still get hit by a car. So I'm not used to just crossing when cars, even when cars slow down. But for the first time, I was like, oh my God, people are fighting with each other just to make sure the other one goes first. No, you go. No, you go. No, you go. Please, no, you go. I was like, okay, this is truly nice, but it's incredibly aversive. Meaning folks over there, by way of culture, generally speaking, are so unwilling to face something head on that the way that they face it is by not facing it at all. Right? It's by just saying, well, I'm not even going to put myself in a situation to sound racist or to say something racist or to stick my foot in my mouth. And so it's important, though, that when honest meets nice, we're able to take on that crossroad, that intersection, in a way that allows for that tension to exist for what it is, especially when we have such a tension as the history of the United States, the way history informs contemporary practice, and the future and aspiration of becoming anti-racist that we're trying to get to. So here I have my first question for you all, okay? And my first question is, what will make an atmosphere most comfortable for you? What would make an atmosphere, a campus, a community, a climate, just an atmosphere most comfortable for you? And I have the chat open here, so please feel free to just go in there and respond, one word, one sentence, whatever makes you feel comfortable. But this is a way to begin to think about what makes us comfortable. Diversity, value and respect, a sense of belonging. Yes. One word I don't have to code switch. And I'm going to address code switching, Stephanie, right on, because I have a different framing around code switching. What else? What makes an atmosphere comfortable for us? An attitude, a good attitude, right? That everyone wants to thrive. Indeed, positive co-workers, even through the tough times, right? We're here to build and advance the work, though we also need space to be able to reflect and heal and address our mental well-being and our emotional well-being and our spiritual well-being. We don't talk about that enough, the way that institutions, if you allow them, can really kill spirits. If I could depend on people, Asking what I mean, want, instead of making assumptions. Me, I like that. Me, I make me comfortable, right on. For me, the key is trust. People talking with others, open and honest communication, real relationships. But the thing about real relationships is that it truly takes time to cultivate relationships. And we've gotten so accustomed to building relationships informed by a business model that we don't do so with a cultural underpinning, right? It's anchored in the cultural elements of how we connect to each other as human beings. Respect, feeling like your ideas and what you have to present and contribute matter, and that you're valued. Seeing people from different backgrounds, and for people from different backgrounds, seeing people from their very own backgrounds. So it's not just one Black person or one Asian person or one Native person, and on. Although we truly never know what people are at the end until we get to know each other and talk to each other. That we're progressive. Yes, the land acknowledgement is so key for a lot of people. Authenticity, man. Authenticity is a big one for me. That's why I'm here. Because President Davison, she lets me be me, and I could appreciate that. Because a lot of institutions, they may struggle with me a little bit, or a lot of it. Dialogue, yes, just opening that door for communication. Thank you all so much for participating, contributing. I'm going to get off the chat now and kind of keep it going. But everything you all just highlighted is so important, right? And I want to kind of make this clear sort of upfront, right, around this idea of allyship or accomplishment in the social justice arena and world. And it's so important I throw this out there, because even as we see a diversity of representation and folks from different backgrounds, racial backgrounds, gendered, as in gendered with an ED backgrounds, as in construction, but still acknowledging gendered backgrounds and other backgrounds, that when we show up in performative allyship and we don't truly understand what allyship looks like, then it comes across as it has no substance. It also comes across as damaging. It's a way to lose trust. It's a way for people to say, it's like a campus climate survey that sits on the shelf. Every 3 years, they're gonna ask you to take it. And if you see no action being taken within those 3 years, you're gonna be like, well, why the hell am I gonna waste my time filling that out? Right? It draws attention from the actual root cause of the work that we need to be advancing. And in many ways, it's also hijacking work for people who are looking to build social capital, not necessarily to address the issues, right? So those pieces are really important to understand. Now, here's a question that I have that I want to just invite a little dialogue as we get into some frameworks and foundation, and that is, how can we rupture current understandings and practices, often grounded in dominant and epistemic framing, to provide more critical approaches to advocating inclusive excellence and equitable outcomes? What are some of the things that we can do? How do we rupture this? And if it's okay, I would like to welcome folks to chime in, to actually, respond to this if you feel comfortable openly. If you throw your hand up, or if you just kind of roll in and say, hey, I like to respond, I'll go ahead and facilitate from here. We'll take just about 2-3 minutes to focus on this, but I want to throw that out there. What do I refer to when I say epistemic, dominant rupturing? What am I saying?
Well, I'll jump in here and say, one of the things that I think would be helpful is the welcoming and supporting of the narrative of folks who are voiceless, right? Understanding who people are beyond the surface level and creating space to do that with intention consistently.
I love that, Dr. Ross, because it's so real to center that as part of the narrative, to center that as part of the strategy unapologetically, is truly a rupture. And we don't think of it as this big sort of issue, but it's really at the heart of so much. All right, let me look at the chat right quick. I think we need to look beyond a fear mindset. Absolutely. Personal commitment and responsibility to check our own privilege, prejudice, and ableism. Yes. If we're not able to self-reflect, and to do so with a sense of ownership, right? To do so with a sense of I self-reflect because I want to grow and become better and be the best at what I do, especially when I have students' lives in my hands. You must start with yourself. You must start with your own personal biases. Reject deficit ideology, absolutely. Another big one when we think about rupturing, right? Epistemic rupturing, breaking with privileged ways. And even those privileged ways show up in different ways because even look at me, right? Like I'm a Afro Taino Arawak Boricua, which really means I'm Black Puerto Rican. Uh, but when I always like to enter through that lens, Afro Taino, the census don't even know how to respond to me. They're like, "Is that a new tribe?" And I always have to respond back like, "A new tribe? What are you talking about? How can there be new tribes? That's ancestral." But it's also the same way that I'm going to experience marginality there. I'm going to also own that oppressor oppressed paradox. As a male, as a cisgendered person, as a heterosexual, officially now middle class. Although I'm from the hood of hoods, I always have to acknowledge, right? I'm not in the hood no more. I mean, I'm in my own hood, but like I'm not struggling no more financially the way I was growing up, all the way through about age probably like 35, which is not, maybe 10 years ago. But it's all to say that we have to understand the ways in which we are oppressed and marginalized, but also the ways in which we are privileged and the ways in which we benefit. And how do we, mark those moments so that when opportunities present themselves for you to advocate or for us to advocate, that we're able to advocate in that way. I'm gonna go to the chat real quick. All right. Yes, impact versus intent. And that's a big one. That was one of the guidelines to think about language. Language matters. Most students will be afraid to challenge the sage on the stage, but I have seen it happen and welcome it. Absolutely agree with that. And privilege itself isn't bad. It's how you choose to use and leverage your privilege. Absolutely agree with that commentary, right? And that's why it's important to own both the marginalized elements of who we are, but also the privileged elements of who we are, because there's great power there if we truly understand how to leverage it and nurture it in ways that equitize the playing field for more equitable outcomes. Indeed. So let's go over some quick frameworks. Let me acknowledge that I'm going to assume that a lot of us, are advanced and we do this work all the time, equity work that is, and we know a bit more than others, and that's okay. And we may have some people here who are maybe just getting their foot in the door, are just beginning to examine and explore these issues, these topics. And so I want to kind of create a space for all that to coexist together. All right. So it's okay for you to show up where you're at. Now, it's so important for us, particularly, to be attentive to this. This is the model of Chakti Butler. I don't know if y'all know who is Dr. Chakti Butler. She's out of Oakland. She is the documentarist. She wrote several films, very popular, a huge go-to person, especially around equity work and healing work. One of her first film was focused on women and intersectionality, women of color, but also white women, just that conversation. Another film she did, Cracking the Codes of Systemic Racism and Inequities. It's a phenomenal film. I would say it's like the updated version of The Color of Fear Part 2. Do y'all know that film, The Color of Fear? Right on, yeah. So Victor, that's my uncle. That's like my uncle. And Shakti is like Mama Shakti. And so it's to say that, pedigree matters. But I love that she put this model together because she really brings it together and says, look, what we're dealing with today is a combination of history, culture, and identity, right? we have to be mindful about what came before us that laid the groundwork for the injustices that continue to take place, to still take heed, right? We have a long way before we uproot them. It's a reality grounded in the history that continues to permeate. That we focus on culture too, right? Part of the model says that, culture is not necessarily, how sometimes you say, oh, culture, and people right away, they're like, oh, Madagascar, Canada, Indonesia, Brazil. And it's like, well, no, culture is just kind of the shared practice, values. There's so many different ways to look at culture in a way where we, fit, in a way where we feel comfortable, in a way where we recognize, acknowledge who we are in very particular groups, and that crosses across identities. And then identity, right? All the different identities that we are. And so, at times I do this exercise. I didn't think it was like an appropriate one for this one. I came in here under the assumption that this group has at least engaged in some identity exercise of sorts. And so I didn't want to kind of replicate that. But, when you do some activities that ask you to lay out, how do you identify, how much power do you assign to each, how much leverage do you assign? And then at times you have some people that take it further, and they may ask a question like, if I was to ask you to remove 3 of those, which will you remove? Which then puts you in a conundrum, because now all of a sudden you're being asked to take away parts of yourself. And how do we truly do that when we need to be looking at ourselves as intersectional beings, right? We can't look at ourselves as if, we're just one salient piece of who we are. We got to look at ourselves holistically in all our identities. And through the internal mechanisms of this model that is grounded in power of economics, first is bias. And we're going to get into some of the bias later. Then it's privilege. The idea that you are born with, or that you are born into a world, and as a result of certain parts of your identity, you're privileged in a way that other people aren't. Privilege, you can't highlight privilege more visibly than what we've seen transfold literally over the last 5 years. When you think about who gets shot, who gets to live, right? Who gets arrested safely to see another day, who doesn't even have that privilege, because our bias is so deep that criminality, or the association of criminality to Black and brown bodies, is so deep that we don't even give people an opportunity to show up the next day. Internalized racism is also another way to say neocolonialism. And internalized racism is deep because how sometimes we have conversations and somebody's like, oh yeah, Black and brown people could be racist too. I want to break that down right quick. That is absolutely accurate, but you need to add a critical framework to that commentary. Black and brown people from a place of power cannot be racist to truly have impact on somebody's life. But Black and brown people from a place of internalized racism can certainly practice white supremacy, right? And that's how Black and brown people could then be racist, not from a place of power, but from a place of engaging themselves in ideas that are grounded in patriarchy, that are grounded in white racism, that are grounded in heteronormativity, that are grounded in this power dynamics where they uphold ideals of that supremacist dominant thinking, but not in the way, right? And that, to me, my friends, I just want to be very, I want to mark this particularity because it matters. I like the book by Ibram Kendi, How to Be an Anti-Racist. However, while it is a good book, it's not my go-to. I would prefer the book So You Want to Talk About Race, The Sister from Seattle, right? And the reason that I say that is because while that book by Ibram kind of says everyone can be racist, I don't think it truly breaks down that racism from a Black and brown perspective, the neo-colonial element, how the way in which dominant ideology is practiced by Black and brown bodies, not necessarily that Black and brown people can be racist. And that's such an important distinction. I actually think that his book stamped from the beginning, it's a much, much solid reader by way of really understanding how we got to where we're at. Then I want to now go to the external. And let me, before I go to the external, I always like to check on the chats. The color of fear, yes, truth. Man, I'm a post-colonial scholar, Stephen. So whether it's Said, whether it's Foucault, whether it's Fanon, I could go on, and whether it's Mignolo, whether it's Quijano, that's my game right there. My dissertation is actually on post-colonial studies and education. Oh, Stephen, we're gonna get along. We're gonna get along. That's word. So yes, that's actually a really great book by Frantz Fanon. But and even I think that Frantz sort of really good reader, because that one's dope too, is Red Shit of the Earth. It's another book I would suggest, phenomenal book. So let me go to the external right quick. The external deals with the relationships, right? Our interpersonal, our institutional, and our structural. The interpersonal being those relationships we develop across groups, with each other, with other individuals, and the way that we show up to those relationships and what we bring to that, both the good and the bad. And institutional, right? Institutional really has to do with the way in which organizations are informed by structures. So this is a perfect example right here. We are part of an institution that relies on federal policy. It relies on state policy. The federal and the state policy are the structures that inform what we have to do, which is why so many states have had such an issue trying to get critical history books into the curriculum, because in some cases, the structure is saying, hey, if you do that, you're gonna get in trouble. Right, and threaten their lives. And so then we see sort of revisionist histories instead of just being honest about the way history went down. So, and that's why we see so much struggle in history curriculum, is because we have, teachers who actually want to use critical readings, want to do critical pedagogy, want to actually transform classrooms and lives. And then the state steps in, puts an accreditation in place and says, you cannot teach that. And if you do, you can't work here. So they pin our livelihoods against each other, right? Our livelihood versus the need to do the critical work. But I would suggest the work of Chakti just from a place of having not only the model, but if you haven't seen Cracking the Codes, that's a phenomenal film. And I think they did a phenomenal job also producing it in a way that is not only relatable, but where people of all different walks and backgrounds could truly sit with it and learn from it and engage with it. All right. Now, I always like to put this one up, right? Now, I thought your people celebrated Black History in the month of February, but my little bro right here, he like, nope, that's for y'all. Man, that month is for y'all. So y'all could actually just have a little month where you can, kind of learn a little bit about, art culture. And we in the game all year round, right? I don't get to turn off who I am here or there. No matter where I go, I'm Black or brown. And on the occasion, like if I'm in Michigan, I may be Arab. It depends, man. I'm that ambiguous cat. So if I'm in Cali, I'm Mexican. If I'm here, people are still trying to figure me out. They're like, he like looks brown, but like he's kind of like, he looks Black, but he kind of acts Black, but he's like not really like the Mexican type. Until they finally get to that place. If I'm in Miami or Florida, I'm Cuban. If I'm in New York, I'm Puerto Rican or Dominican, depends on the generation. In the 70s, 80s, I would have been Puerto Rican. Now I'd be Dominican. And in Michigan, I'm Arab. And it's interesting because, one day I was out there and I had this young boy come holler at me in their native tongue. And I couldn't, understand what they were saying. I was young. I was a McNair scholar and I was traveling for a conference. So like I wanted to be down with them. I didn't want to relate to them that I didn't know what they were saying, right? I was like, maybe I could pick up, maybe. And then you could tell that like after like 15 seconds, they were like, oh, this fool in us. They just walked away. They're like 11, 12-year-olds just straight dissing me, right? And so how do we own that, right? How do we own that tension of of also existing in a place where there is this norm that if we don't identify it, then you just become that ambiguous person, and people are always trying to figure out. It's like when somebody asks me where I'm from, they ask me like 500 times. Like first it's like, where you from? And I'm like, oh, I live in the north side. And then it's like, nah, but where you really from? I'm like, oh, you cut my accent, my bad, yo, I'm from New York. And they're like, nah, but where you really from? And see, by the time it gets to the fourth, where are you really from? You start to get this feeling inside like, damn, dude, man, you just making it sound like I can't be from here. Like, I know where you're going with that. I know the answer you want me to give you, but the reality is that because the border crossed the US, you have a lot of Mexicans here, and this is their land. And this is where they're from. And they've been here since the Treaty of Guadalupe. Actually, they've been here since before the Treaty of Guadalupe. And so when people are like, where you're from, and people say, I'm from here, just believe them. They're from here, you know, right? And that's always an interesting, you know, particularity in all this. So what does cultivating social justice look like? And I want to kind of flip this a little bit, because this is not just about democracy or being inclusive and creating participatory processes, although those matter. This is about affirmation, validation, and action. How do we take voices and act on them? Or are we just getting conversations together? People are talking and they're letting it out, which is great. I would never diss a conversation. Conversations are important, and you could even say it's a form of action. However, it doesn't get at the structural. So how do you take those voices and compile them in such a way that it then influences the changes that we need to make organizationally and structurally? Social justice is also about representation. However, we've also learned, that representation is far from everything, right? You could have some Black and brown people who don't care about social justice. And then you have some white people who are some badasses and will throw down. And so, you know, everything's across the spectrum. This is the biggest one, because this is the power and positionality one, right? In order to truly cultivate social justice orientation and models in our institutions, the distribution of resources must be equitable. The resources, right? CRT talks about this. This is also the work of Marxism. This is also the work of post-colonialism. I mean, we could go on and on. If there's no resources there to commit to whatever the work looks like, everything else becomes more difficult. And to me, that's the most important piece, because it's the one that most places don't do, which is why you see like organizations or offices that do this work either staffed by 2 people or have a budget of like $30,000, while the other office has a budget of $200,000. The inequities become incredibly apparent. Now, this last one is interesting because, you know, there was a time where you can maybe argue that folks are physically safe, but we've seen very well that that's not the case anymore. We can no longer, even in education, guarantee psychological and physical safety. But I am going to also add a different element to that, and that is that when you think about, you know, safe or, you know, courageous spaces, what I want people to take away from this is that safe spaces are cultivated and nurtured over time. So if you have 8 people in a space and they've been together for 2 months and they begin to really feel comfortable, treat each other like family, build that sort of you know, family orientation, and begin to really be like, yeah, I can be honest with you. The moment that one person leaves that space and another person joins, you have to do it all over again, because you're now trying to get to know this person. So we have to take relationship building out of the way we understand it now through dominant narratives and a dominant lens, and actually posit it forward as something that is about cultivating and building and mending that trust. And mending is a word we need to use more in higher education, and it's actually a big part of the organic work that community colleges do, but they don't market. They don't demarcate it through their discourse in a way that says, yeah, part of what we're doing is connecting with the community, involving the community, serving the community, creating access for the community, creating pipelines for the community to be able to have access to other things. And so how do we make that clear, especially in community college spaces, that mending, that reconciling piece? In some places in community colleges, it's not to say that it's this natural thing that happens everywhere, but it's simply to say that as part of the anchor mission and vision of these institutions, that work organically happens just by way of who's present. And I know we all got different definitions of anti-racism, but I'm going to honor my homie over there, Stephen, and bring up the work of George Sefadeh. George Sefadeh is an anti-colonial scholar. He's out of Canada. I think he does some of the most remarkable anti-racism work, theoretically and practically, but hardly nobody knows who he is because we're so caught up in the trendy, who's the new anti-racist, theorist who is, out there throwing down, that we forget foundations. And when you think about anti-racism work, let me be clear, anti-racism work has been going on since the 1500s. That's so important to mark. And so we get to this place now 525, 26 years later, where we're like trying to figure out, or everybody has sort of this perspective around definitions. Well, I have my own perspective on that. And I want to be clear, you got to respect equity, diversity, and inclusion work the same way we respect chemistry. Right? Like, I don't run up on somebody and be like, well, let me tell you my version of chemistry. No, I don't agree with that definition of chemistry. Let me tell you what I think. And this is my definition of chemistry, and you got to take it. No, it's a canon. It's an academic canon. It's a disciplinary canon. EDI should be respected like a canonic space, not like this thing that just fluctuates and you can kind of make of it what it wants, especially because, like any other discipline, even if unmarked, it has 500 years of work behind it. So when you think about anti-racism work, one, what it does, it really does offer sort of a theoretical and practical response to challenge dominant questions around the nature of race and racism and the intersections between power and difference. Right? At the heart of racism, this is where it is. So I never like to even use the word nature. And yes, I'm like a critical discursive person like that. I'm a big fan of the work of Van Dyck, who does critical discourse work. And, part of what we do is rupture. So I always like to say about the nurture of racism, because racism is nurtured. There's nothing natural about it, right? It's also a political practice. It's a way to address interlocking systems. Right? It's a way to address the way that institutions corroborate with each other to maintain systems of power. And that piece is so important to mark and to add language to in that way. And then lastly, what I think anti-racism truly does, and this is so important, is it explicitly names issues of race and social difference as issues of power and equity, not just difference. So when you look at it through this lens, anti-racism, you begin to understand that racism is about othering. Racism is about racializing. Racism is about gendering. Racism, you got to add the ing into, it's like the word minority versus minoritized. Right? I've never really taken well to that word minority. Like, people come at, yeah, and you're a minority. I'm like, hell no. Man, my people are deep in the world, man. We all over the world, if you want to really look at it like that. And I didn't grow up on some Tom Hanks Minority Report, just boom, coming out my mom like Minority Report. No. Over time, we are minoritized. We are racialized. We are thrown into boxes and definitions and categories that people say who we are, and we contest that. I contest that all the time. So for example, I identify as Latinx politically. not racially, not ethnically, politically, because I know there is power in consensus, in solidarity. It's about political prowess and movement. How do I stand in solidarity with others so that we could have greater impact? But my racial and ethnic ethnicity is Afro-Taino Arawak. And the reason, even more political, why I say Afro is because I understand very well that I'm a light-skinned Black. If you look at my grandfather, he's as dark as Manute Ball. And okay, maybe I don't know Manute Ball, but he's a very dark-skinned man, a very chocolate man. And then he married my great grandmother, who was the opposite. She wasn't even white; she was pink. She was so white, she was pink. And they got together, they fell in love, and before you know it, then the next generation, it starts to create sort of that lighter skin, and then the next generation, right? And so it's interesting to look at my family, because I have family members that are incredibly white looking. You know how sometimes you see a white person with like blue eyes, and you make your assumptions. We're all guilty of assumptions and biases. I am too. And then they start busting out Spanish really good, really well. They're like, but tú sabes que blah, blah, blah. And then you have like a triple checks reaction. You're like, oh, where'd that come from? And then you find out that they're like from Uruguay or Paraguay or Argentina or even Mexico or even Puerto Rico, right? They're like, why wouldn't I talk Spanish good? This is where I'm from. You see that in the Black community too. You hear a Black person talk Spanish and you're like, yo, you speak really good Spanish. Where you learn? Homies are looking at you like, where I learn? I'm from Panama. I'm from Colombia. I'm from Venezuela. I'm from the Dominican Republic. I'm from Puerto Rico, right? And so that element around othering and racialization really matters in that way. And now whiteness, the invisibility of whiteness. And I think the best work that I could put you around whiteness in the context of higher education is my work and the work of Nolan Cabrera. So if you want to write that name down, Nolan Cabrera, because we're two of the first scholars within the field of higher ed that started to say, why are we always talking about identity without talking about whiteness? White and whiteness needs to be part of the diversity conversation, but through a different lens of positionality and power. But it cannot be absent from the conversation in higher ed. So when you think about whiteness as a cultural and theoretical framework, you're talking about a racialized identity that refers to the way whiteness and their customs, cultures, beliefs become the standard, become the norm, which is why I'm such a rupturer, because everybody is so in tune to the unmarking of whiteness in the spaces. Meaning, if I start dancing, people are right away, they're going to be like, oh, this cat must be Latino, man. Look how he moves his hips. Right? It can never be a white thing, right? I'm pinned against the whiteness, and the whiteness becomes the norm, and everything else becomes this sort of additive, marginal, around the circle effort or perspective instead of the norm. So when I show up, I don't show up to institutions. I used to, right? But it takes learning, it takes self-reflection and transformation. I don't show up to the institutions trying to belong. Not that I don't care not to belong. I show up to institutions seeking to reclaim. It's a very different way of showing up. It allows me to be there for my students better. It allows me to work with students in a way where I relate to them and support them by saying, show up as you, show up authentic, show up and trust that you are the norm. And that piece is so empowering to students, because then they begin to develop that confidence to be able to navigate and negotiate spaces of higher ed in the way that they're not used to, in a way that is not deficit-based. And then what you do with that is you take something like code switching. I want to go back to code switching, which I actually call the rubber band theory. Because to me, code switching means that in 1 minute, I'm going to sound like this, very professional, because if I don't, then people might think that I'm not from here. Or the next minute, I may just be like, hey, yo, this is how I'm coming at you, and you're just going to have to feel me and come a different way in the space, right? Code switching, how to act or show up or talk a certain way in certain spaces. However, for me, that's a rubber band. There's no way to truly separate those. So what's really going on, you know how sometimes you take a rubber band, you take it this direction, and then you take it this direction, and then somebody else could pull it up, and then somebody else could put it this way, but you could pull it in so many different ways until it snaps. So to me, the idea of navigating spaces of resistance is about all that code switching, all that rubber banding, being the organic you. So if I have 10 different personalities, that's my authenticity. That's how I exist in spaces that I seek to negotiate, navigate, and be successful at. It doesn't mean that I'm code switching. It means that I'm flipping between the different parts of myself. And all of them make who you are. I'm going to go to the chat real quick. All right. Yeah, no, indeed. Rest in peace, Manute, man. He was heck of tall. This happens to me all the time. No doubt. Playing the race card, exposing white power and privilege, but he indeed. And then as a third culture kid, yes. Right, and that's rubber banding, right? And that's why I like to reframe it in a way that we're not, when I have found in working with students that when we engage in the code switching language, it truly hits them in a certain way because it makes them almost have to intentionally show up in different ways, in ways where they're like, well, this is me and this is not me. And I like to relate to them that all of that is everything that you are. It's almost like hanging out on the block. Like, let me flip it like this. Actually, I'm going to do this activity with you right quick because you're going to see where I'm going with this, all right? I'm going to tell you a story and you're going to finish it for me. And I know exactly how you're going to finish it because that's how prevalent this is. One day in 7th grade, that was my first time I got straight A's. I was so happy, so delighted. I went to Mom Dukes. I'm like, Mommy, mira, todas. And she looked at me with this pride. She looked at me like she was so happy. She looked at me like, that's what you should be doing. I'm so proud of you. And I loved getting that validation from Mama Dukes because most of the time, if I acted the fool, she would hit me with a chancla. She'd throw the chancla at me. Y'all know, some of y'all what I'm talking about. For those of you who don't know what chancla is, that is a flip-flop. But you see, Latinx and actually most of Black and brown parents have gotten so good at using chanclas that they are to the Caribbean what boomerangs are to Australians. It's a straight boomerang chancla. So they throw it and it's gets you upside the head, and then like a second later, it's right back in their hand. And you're like, how the hell you do that? How you throw the chancla? And like, how? And it confuses you. Now, when I went down to the block after talking to Mom's Dukes, I chill with my boys. We all kicking it on the block. I bring my report card. Now, I don't know. I'm happy. I got straight A's. So I'm like, hey, check this out, man. Straight A's, straight A's. And while I'm showing my people, instead of giving me the same reaction Mom Dukes gave me, they said, damn, y'all, look at Mike trying to be all, what am I trying to be? Y'all go ahead and put that down in the chat for me. I'm just trying to be intelligent, but what do they think I'm trying to be? Boom, 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 boom. You see how that works? You see the experience and what it looks like, right? I couldn't just be a brilliant Black and brown brother. I had to be white, or it's me trying to be white, as opposed to just being some dope Black brother, And so that's why sometimes I mess with people. Sometimes when I do some presses and I'm around and somebody does really well and they get straight A's, I'm like, man, why are you trying to be black? Man, why are you over there trying to be black? Now, I use it as a lesson, right? Then I kind of take it from there. We get a conversation going. It's not that I actually mean it, but it's a way of helping marginalized communities own their brilliance, make them aware that intelligence, that grind, that, you know, the way we show up and the brilliance we show up with, that ancestralness of who we are is everything that we are. It is who we are. There's nothing white about that. There's nothing black about that. There's nothing brown about that. It is the brilliance of owning who we are. But y'all saw that. I didn't have to even finish that. Y'all finished it for me. And it's so prevalent in marginalized communities, right? Now, I want to just do a check-in and just see how y'all doing, how y'all feeling. Just, you know, 2-3 minutes. What's going through your head? Feel free to either put it on the chat, or if any of y'all want to come to the forefront and hang with me and just share a reflection, please feel free to do so. Yes.
Maestro, just want to say what's up and say thank you. You know, a lot of what you're talking about really came down, not just with my friends, but like with my family. When I was in college, doing my undergrad, I remember my family, you know, everybody getting together on the weekends, and they're like, this whitewashed fool in college, Mr. Education and all this. It brings back a lot of like horrific memories from family coming down on you. I think now they understand, but still, you know, those memories will never go away.
No, Benicio, hermano, man. First of all, good to see you, bro. It's always good to see you. I miss you here on the campus. But you know, they really got someone really dope in you out there. And then secondly, absolutely, man, the idea of familia, bro, not validating and creating that internal struggle within you because you kind of want to fit, you don't want to distance yourself, and then having to negotiate that is actually tougher than negotiating the spaces. Because that's your familia, that's your space, that's your cultura, that's where you belong. So like, you don't want to upset Mom Dukes. You know how long it took me before I was able to like put on my armor so that if I upset Mom Dukes, the chancla wasn't gonna hurt. You know, because she'll make a comment, and I'm like, oh, mommy, yeah, right. And then you can only take it for so long before you're like, mira, mommy, I love you with all respect. Tranquila, before you go there, you kind of do this just in case, you know, and then you kind of challenge your parents or your grandparents or your uncles, and you're like, look, I'm not dissing you. It doesn't mean you're done. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just helping us decolonize with each other. That's all. That is all.
That's right.
And it's so real. So thanks for sharing that, Benicio. So here we are now, dealing with implicit bias as a result of histories and structures and interlocking systems, and the way we consume knowledge describes when we have this attitudes towards people, and we associate stereotypes without really knowing that we're doing that. And there's some different ways in which implicit bias shows up in the right, whether it's an alien in your own land, or ascription of intelligence, or intrinsic skills and personality types, or the myth of meritocracy. I won't go through them all, but you know, those are also right there for you to kind of have the different discourses and ways that this goes down and happens. Because then once we get past implicit bias, it is the implicit bias that leads to the microaggressions that create toxic communities. And you know, I'm going real quick, you know, just kind of quote, you know, my brother Dr. Ross, who, you know, I love, you know, for the first time I heard when we was, you know, him and I was talking, and we just did a virtual voices together. But you know, he's like, you know, these aren't micro aggressions or micro this. These are straight, you know, micro abuses. These are macro abuses. And I agree with him, right? It's sort of this, you know, this assumption that after a while, if we're told over and over, why do we keep doing it? And so these slights are more than just aggressions. They're abuses. They hit us hard. They're not just aggressions. These are just nicer ways, acceptable, commodified ways of saying racism, of saying sexism, of saying religious bigotry, right? And I could go on that route. Where are you from? Or agents are naturally smart, or women, oh, they're so emotional. You know, you can have them leading, you know, although last I checked, most of the nations led by women are doing incredibly, incredibly well. I'm just saying, right? Proof is in the pudding. If you really work hard, you can truly succeed. Then if that was the case, then women wouldn't only be, leading, they'd be running the world. When you think about who are the hardest working people out there, right? And then women of color, even more so with respect to their experiences coming through the migrant fields, having to go through this extra layers of discrimination. That's why when you look at the Suffrage Act and the suffrage movement, there was a movement with some color by way of influence, but even at that time, voting wasn't open to women of color. That was for white women. Women of color didn't get their chance to really, contribute in a democratic way until the civil rights movement of the 60s. Now, microaggressions, we know them to be, right, the commonplace, daily verbal behavioral things that eventually get at you and slice you until you bleed out. The same microaggressions then, result in different types of inequities, right? You have particular insults, you have invalidations, you have assaults, but I will say that insults and invalidations are the most common ones in higher education when we commit those against our own peers as faculty and staff, or also, against students, when we communicate, for example, in a way that disvalidates or excludes or negates somebody's experience or subjectivity. Well, I don't know, man, I think you're taking it the wrong way. Or, you're taking it too serious. Or is that really how you experienced it? You think you might have taken them the wrong way and you didn't really get what they were saying, right? Or even when you think about insults, so ways that we demean people's backgrounds, and we don't do it with intention, but that's what it leads to. And then the micro assault obviously is the more is the more overt one out of the three, but they all lead to the same impact. Now, I want to ask you all a question again. Okay, and this question really gets to think about a time when your first impression of someone was wrong. Like, what was the underlying assumption you had that was incorrect? And I'm gonna have some folks chime in on the chat if you're comfortable. I hope you're comfortable. I hope this is a space where we can show up real and truly understand that when we have cuts, we have to address them. If not, they continue to get infected and infected and infected until they got to take your arm off. And that's what we're trying to prevent, right? What we're trying to do is address the cut, address the infection so we could heal. So I want you to reflect on this. Think of a time when your first impression of someone was wrong. What was there? What was the underlying assumption that was incorrect? And then I'm going to ask for about 2-3 people who haven't chimed in yet. If you're comfortable, I hope you are. I welcome you to throw down and share with me and share with this community so we could also learn from each other. And then be mindful about who bears the brunt. I always got that. That's a particular guidance tip that I really truly practice and live by. So I'll give you all a minute or 30 seconds to sit with that, and then I'm going to open it up or just ask people to chime in. Let me open the chat. Oh, yes. Okay, I'm seeing some. Yes, imposter syndrome, no doubt. I'll hit on that because that's such an important piece of this too. Yeah, no, they don't. They don't see micro at all. Absolutely. That's why I like that term macro abuse with an A. Macro abuse. All right, so here you have one. I thought a cook I worked with was a jerk to me because I was a woman. Josephine, if you don't mind, will you mind coming up and talking a little bit about or sharing about that experience?
Oh yeah, I was working in the kitchen, and of course I was not of course, but usually I was the only woman, but this time I was the only woman, and this dude had kept coming for me. He turned down my music for one, then he changed the channels for two, and then he poured out a pot of water that doing. I was doing something, and he poured out my water, and I was like, oh, okay, this guy, he's from Bolivia, like because I'm a woman, that's how it is because they're macho, stupid thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, turns out he was just a jerk because he's a jerk, and then like I had to, kind of growl back at him, and then we ended up being friends. But I immediately assumed that it was because coming from some macho thing, and it's like, no, that's just how he was, plain and
Hey,
simple.
no, I appreciate that. I love the realness that you're telling that story with because there's like nuances to that, right? There's the first of all, there's the trauma, right, Josephine? There's the sort of, oh man, machismo is some patriarchy. I'm a woman. I know how this goes. I'm used to it, which shouldn't be a thing, but it's the reality, right, of patriarchal systems. And then you found out that he was an equal opportunity jerk, but that once you got to know him, he was actually a cool cat. Does that sound about right?
That's about it. Yeah, and I learned a lot from him. He was pretty cool. I learned that and plus I was shrinking back. I was like holding my tongue. Usually I wouldn't hold my tongue like that, but I was new on the job, and I was like, well, don't let him see the full strength. You want to keep this job. but but the third strike was taking something off my stove. Like, you already done messed with my music. I was the first one there, man. I paid attention to the rules, dude. Like, but you know, yeah, he was a pretty cool dude.
Right on, but wow, man, that's tough, man. First the music and then touching the stove, man. I would have had issues with the dude too. So I'm seeing here one from Ruth Ann. I was really unaware of the intersectional identities we all have when I first started teaching. I had a Black woman in my Spanish class who described her novia. I corrected her twice to novio. She had to clarify. I made assumptions. Is it Ruth Ann or Ruthann? I always like to ask and just make sure I'm getting it right. I have no shame in learning more and asking. Would you mind talking a little bit about this story or sharing a little bit?
Sure. It's Ruth Ann, so thanks for asking.
Right on.
I am a Spanish faculty member, and it didn't even occur to me. I was in a northern Idaho school, and there wasn't a lot of diversity on campus, and this was a Black woman who played basketball at the school, and we were talking about doing adjectives, right? Adjective agreement in Spanish, right? So this kind of the common. And I think because I saw her as Black, it didn't occur to me that she could also have additional identities. And I still think about that to this day, right? Like, obviously it was ignorance, but that's irrelevant because of the impact, right? The multiple impacts there. So that's a big one in terms of an assumption.
Hey, Ruthann, thank you so much. And Josephine, thank you, for sharing and being vulnerable and for practicing pedagogy, public pedagogy of vulnerability, right? And Ruthann, you bring up such a good point that it sits between the weeds and nobody really sees it, which is there's this sort of permission and audacity for whiteness to be intersectional, right? Oh, I'm white and gay. Or we even learn to make assumptions at times that honor or that intersectionality, but we don't do that with Black and brown. And it's not as seamless as making that connection in a way that it is in dominant communities, so that when you saw Blackness, right, it stopped there versus the, well, what is everything that comes with it? Or how can I think beyond what I see? And I think that's also a structural issue. It's something that we learn in some ways, in biased ways, that says, okay, when I see this, I could think beyond, but when I see this, I get stuck at that.
I think that's right. And I think it goes back to, you know, the work, the self-work, right?
Yes.
Nobody else is going to teach you that unless you become aware of it and then kind of deconstruct your own assumptions.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. And then I have a third one. I thought someone was in my corner because they also identified as Latinx, but there was some underlying sexism at play that caused me to throw my guard right up in the same way I did with other non-Latinx colleagues. It says, Stephanie, please let me know if I'm saying it right or wrong. And would you mind, you know, coming up to the front stage and sharing a little bit about that?
Hi, good to see you all. Yeah, similarly, I had a situation where I identify as Latinx. I thought some of my colleagues who identified the same way, that we were gonna, you know, think and approach issues in the same way. Thought someone was gonna be in my corner. This all had to do with like a job opportunity. It wasn't the case. There was definitely some sexist remarks that came my way as a result. You know, you wear your emotions on your face. You're a little too direct, things that a man wouldn't be told probably. So anyway, it just all completely caught me off guard because I thought this person who also identified as Latinx, like we were on the same wavelength, and just not at all.
Okay, so this was a different sort of assumption. This was, let me see if I could describe this in a way that happens in higher ed, Stephanie, because you bring up such a great point, right? And that is, I remember the first time I was in grad school, when I went in grad school and I was in Iowa. I was at Iowa State. That's where I did my PhD, because there was the only homies willing to throw me a full ride. And you know, you go, man, you know, if you're down to go, you're gonna pay my PhD, I'll hop on that opportunity. Although Iowa is tough. When I think Iowa, I think of all vowels, no syllables. It's like IWOA. It's like IUOA, right? And that just made it weird in itself. So I'm in the first classroom. I see this person across the way that looks like me. So I'm like all confident. I'm like speaking my tongue. I'm challenging the professor. I'm talking about my marginalized experiences. And then I go and seek validation. And so I go to that other person that speaks Spanish, that looks Latinx. I knew they were Latinx. I didn't know what particular nation, but I knew that they were Latinx because they self-disclosed and identified. But then when I hit them up, I'm like, come on, man, back me up. You gotta back me up on this. I know you feel it too. Man, they ended up being like Ted Cruz. You know, I was like, oh, you just kind of caught me off guard. I'm gonna have to sit with that a little bit and stop making these assumptions about who's down or not down, or who can relate to me, or who's gonna share in the same values that I share. And it goes back to, you know, right, getting to know each other first, because you're absolutely, you know, right. You kind of thought this person was in your corner, and before you know it, you're like, oh, okay, it looks like I'm gonna have to just kind of, you know, create some distance between us. And so, no, Stephanie, thank you for sharing, because that's also a good example of the ways that we step into those assumptions in a way that impacts us, or in a way that serve as growing moments and learning opportunities. Oh, word, hold on, I gotta just, so Dana grew up in Iowa, man, more power to you, you know? Iowa was chill. I was able to find some spots, but Iowa is tough. I've never been at a place where the snow comes and 18 inches of ice stay there for like 5 months with sand over the top. And that's beyond the white supremacy there. But hey, no, you make the best out of what you got. And so horrible times in Iowa, but some incredibly good times too. Look, to all of you, again, as Ryan put on there, thank you so much, Stephanie, Ruthann, Josephine, for sharing and trusting me, trusting each other, trusting the space, and practicing, right? The praxis of public vulnerability and the pedagogic tool that it could serve for us to also learn from each other goes a long way. So thank you all for stepping into that. I can't express my gratitude enough. It's important. It's because anytime we put ourselves out there, it's a real vulnerability there. It's not just like, well, just say it. No, we have to be cautious about when we want to say something, how we say it, whether or not we even say it, depending on the space. So here what you have now are some of this general kind of micro inequities, the different ways that they happen, whether that's introducing a certain colleagues with accolades while others just with a name, or when if I was to be here and be like, Dr. Rael or Ross, and then if Josephine here, and I'm saying Josephine because she's right, on the screen, and I just say Josephine instead of Dr. Richardson, right? Which happens so often in higher education, or just making assumptions about whether or not somebody's going to like something or not like it, or asking somebody to straighten up their accent, or making facial expressions in the middle of meetings when somebody's talking about something deep, or sharing an experience, or sharing a moment of vulnerability, omitting people from important dialogues or experiences. But you see here, there's quite a bit of inequities that that result because of our inabilities, if we don't do so, to check ourselves. Now, I want to hit on this because we talk about it so much. I'll send this. You could actually find this online. I did not create this. So let me be very particular. What you have there is just some kind of different resources, at least that I think could be useful around anti-racism. But you have three very particular zones. I think for me, it's important to understand about this model is that it's so focused on the interpersonal, individual, and not really on the structural. And the structural is where we want to get at. We don't want to just get to avoidance and denying and trying to be comfortable and then moving from there all the way through understanding my own privilege and then speaking out. I also want to do that in a way where I understand what it means to advocate for transforming structures and be in spaces and build collaborations that allow me, right, to be able to feel like I'm building a squad. Like I'm cultivating, and we're cultivating a movement where we can push together. Because let me be very, very real, and I'm always real about this. When we're able to galvanize together, institutions, they're not going to get rid of 40, 50, 60 people at once. But if you're the only one, and we don't cultivate that organize strategically, even inside, it's very easy to push one person out. And so how do we lean on each other to build that? Because we don't have to agree, right? The thing is not about agreement, and it's not about unity in that way. It's about solidarity. What's the bigger purpose? What is it that we're trying to accomplish around equity work that is bigger than the I? And that's the solidarity work. Oh. Okay, so what we have here now is another question that I want to put up, and that is, how do we, and maybe this one's just for you to sit with, but please feel free to respond in the chat. How do we connect with N2 students, staff, and faculty who bring varied lived experiences and realities to our relationship? How do we do that, right? And this is always a question for me in particular, that I always have and that I always like to throw out there, because we don't think about it enough in this context that is higher education, right? We don't think, we have not only diverse people that we share space with, but they all bring stories. They all bring subjectivities. They all bring narratives. They've all faced something. And so how do we get at that so that we could best know how to show up with cultural relevance, right? With cultural responsiveness, with cultural humility. I'm checking here, just on the chat, just want to make sure. This is something I've picked up pedagogically. Yes, listening to learn. Thank you. Listening to learn, so key. And I'm going to hit on that later because that's so key. So here I offer an example, right, of what at this current time, a lot of our students, faculty, and staff are wrestling with, right? When you think about BIPOC people, they're more likely to be in the front lines. They're a lot of the essential workers. So they have that so the added weight of trying to navigate and negotiate. Wow, do I not do community college this semester? I'm used to taking 3 classes. Should I only take 1? Damn, I got to take care of my family. Oh, no, I got this to worry about. Oh man, they lost their job. So now I have to get another job, at least for the next year until they get back on their feet. And then I could pick up from where, I left off. BIPOC people continue to work through the crisis just to survive economically. And we see the impact that this is having, especially around job cuts. Not to say it's not having an impact on, middle class positions, neither. No, it is. But at a greater number, it's having an impact among, our communities who come from the more humble economic backgrounds, who are from a working class, that rely on industry and blue collar jobs to put food on the table and pay the rent, pay the bills. They're more likely to put themselves at risk. And we see that in the rate of not only deaths, but also hospitalizations. And we've seen that over the past year. Who's more likely than who to end up in a hospital and to die as a result of something like COVID? They're more likely to rely on food banks to be able to feed their families. They're also trying to take care of families and loved ones, and more likely to reside in larger households. I'll tell you, when I moved here from PR, it was real interesting, sort of this low context culture. Like, are you familiar with the film Spanglish? Yeah, no, Derek, thanks for pointing that out. Yes. American Indian or even in the Native Americans are not even listed. They're listed like as other and not really acknowledged, which is such not only a disservice, but it kind of goes against acknowledgement, especially because within our tribes, and I speak in the Arawak Taino, we really choose ourselves as a nation, as a country, not as a not as a part of or a country. No, like we're truly our own country, even if that is across spaces in the way that we understand self-determination. So Spanglish, I want to go to that example, and I do that because if you recall, there was a piece where I think it was Selma Hayek. She starts to go on this vent around space. What space? I didn't know what space was neither until I got here. When someone's like, give me some space. I'm like, space? That's my backyard, huh? Right? It's really interesting, sort of the way that for many of us, when we live in certain households, if it's 10 of us or 5 of us, we're just making it through. But in some cases, we also choose to. Yeah, like Tia lives with me, yes, and Mommy lives with me, yeah, and my cousin lives with me too. And you know what? My homie, who I've known for 20 years, lives with me too. We all live and share this space. And so then you get to this other place where it's like, no, it's 3 of us. My house has to be at least 5,000 square feet. And I'm like, word? Damn, man, that's like wasted space. But it's such a cultural difference in the way that we understand those different struggles. BIPOC people are less likely to have access to healthcare, more likely to have underlying health conditions, and because of the history of medical practice, malpractice, and racist practice, also less likely to trust hospitals. And there's a whole history of that going back to the enslavement of Africans, and a history that is also today's contemporary issues, the practice of sterilization at detention centers, and the ongoingness of such practices in spaces that we don't even talk about, right? So I throw this at you to demonstrate that this is how a lot of our communities are showing up with the struggles, experiences, subjectivities. So we see this then unfolding, right? It's like this compulsion to fix them, issues outside one reality, or if not, folks will get up in there and be like, but we already did that, but we already did a diversity session, but we already gave you this much. I wish they said that about the institution where y'all already did this. I don't know why y'all doing it again. And really limiting diversity to this one-stop shop where everything else is ongoing. Denial of issues and lack of awareness, not really understanding how we learn. These are all barriers that allow, that don't permit us to truly be inclusively excellent, or to achieve inclusive excellence in our respective spaces. But the deepest one is that last bullet point, the need to be in control in all areas of one's complete worldview. It's like when you hit somebody with facts and truth that don't align with the last 30 years of their lives and how they've learned, they fall into this identity crisis. It's like, that's like, what you're saying is that somebody lied to me for the last 20 years. Yeah, that's kind of what I'm saying. Maybe unintentionally, perhaps intentionally, but that's kind of what happened. Or you got a half truth. Somebody hit you with a half truth, and now you're learning the other side of the coin, and it's hitting you because for the longest time, you thought you knew this. And that hits whiteness and patriarchy and religious dominance and heteronormativity, and that could go on and on. But what I'm saying is it hits dominant identities really, really hard. And the second last point, though it's important to point out too, a lack of trust about how others are going to perceive you. We have to consider, unfortunately, but sometimes we also overconsider what other people are going to think about us, instead of just, if we're committed to this DEI work, then it's not about us, and we can't worry about what fulano, fulana, or fulanix, which is like a Boricua term of like saying this person, that person, are going to think about you if you're about the work. This work of DEI is a really robust collective place when we can do wonderful work, but it could also be an incredibly isolating space where you feel like no one's rolling with you, where you're alone most of the time and you're doing it all on your own, right? That weight can really hit you. So we have to account for what that balance can look like. The moments that we appreciate sharing space like this, and the moments where life hits you and you're like, this is so much work. How do I take all this on? I can't fix the world. And so how do we focus on our sphere of influence? And this is what we're going to get into next as we, begin to bring this to a close, right? Is leadership and praxis. Like, what does this really then look like, right? I'm reminded by a very particular quote. One of my favorite authors on civility is Ed Langerek. And he's a philosophy professor, well, now retired, but he wrote the book Civil Disagreement, Personal Integrity in a Pluralistic Society. And quote, I'll read this because I think around this work, this is a way to also bring allies in. And quote, Dr. Langerek says, civility is treating others with appropriate courtesy and respect. Much of what civility involves is context relative, and often it is relative mainly to what is needed for a shared task or a mutual endeavor. I want to hit on that word, mutual endeavor. Then the question of what civility requires in a given context or association is related to the question of what we're trying to accomplish together. Notice that the context may well include people who are strangers and even past opponents. So we cannot rely on affection, friendship, or familiarity to set boundaries. Civility is something we intentionally bring to the situation, not necessarily something that flows from natural feelings. Notice also that civility involves patience and restraints, and it has much to do with what we will not do to each other as what we will do for each other. When we elect or choose to be part of a higher education institution and community, in some ways, there's a social contract that comes with that says, this is bigger than me. And how do I show up to the middle in a way that I can push, but also in a way that I can step back, but certainly more than anything in a way that I'm putting my good foot forward, because I'm thinking about how do we best serve students. The reality is that when you get, most campuses are interesting. Even the Auraria campus right here where I'm at, like you get people from rural America, right? From the outskirts of rural land, Colorado, who come here and they're like, oh my God, this is the most diverse place ever. And they mean it because that's their lived reality. And then you have people like from here, from Denver, from Aurora, or from some of the different communities, and they come to the same space and they're like, damn, this place is white. This place is really, really white. I'm going to have to adjust. And the reality is they're both right. And so how do we meet at that middle ground to navigate and negotiate the neoliberal and colonial politics of higher education, understanding what we want to put in, what we want to get out, but what we want to put in on our students and what we want our students to eventually also get out so that they could go on in their full selves. Now, I'm not going to get into equity and inclusion very much. This is just a slide I always like to have here because it informs the diversity, leadership, inclusive excellence conversation. But, you know, when you think equity, think about outcomes and think about access, right? Think about access, think about outcomes. Think about the foot in the door and think about the end result. Those are both two of the equity issues. And the access is like, you don't just get into a space and say, okay, you're here, we're good, we got diversity. No, there's the cultivation, there's the campus climate, workplace cultivation, classroom cultivation element of this. And there's also the outcomes element of it. But then inclusion really kind of wrestles with the ways in which we are intentional about who we invite to the table, because inclusion only exists because there was such a thing as exclusion. Inclusion is not just like this term that came out of nowhere. Oh, we're inclusive. No, inclusion is a direct response to exclusion. And if we want to truly practice and value inclusion, then we do so in the name of rectifying exclusion. And who has been excluded, and how do we assure that that exclusion is now more visible and central in that conversation at the table? So when we think about, diversity leadership, and when we think about our roles in particular, right, we must think about a social justice-based praxis that accounts for privilege, power, and difference in that way, in that conversation. But self-implication, or to even use the work of like a Jackie Alexander or a Chandra Mohanty in third world feminisms, who really talk about co-implication, right? And co-implication is truly working with each other to understand how are we implicated in each other's lives, which really is another way of saying that nobody is not tied to injustices. So if I was to ask, for example, this group a very particular question, right? And here's my question. The question would be, how many of you, and maybe you could just respond here on the chat, how many of you here, if I was to ask you, please answer yes or no, you support cultural genocide? Yes or no? That's the question. And you got to follow through. Yes or no, you support cultural genocide? All right, I'm seeing a lot of no's. Okay, now I hope so, right? And that's where we're gonna go. But yet, I'm not Gandhi. I'm not getting up each morning like, oh, I gotta get up at 5. I gotta make myself some eggs, cut the fruit, and then I'm gonna have to make sure that I thread some clothes together. No, we buy our clothes made by sweatshop labor at the oppression of women throughout the world and young children throughout the world. We have and rely on wireless technology. Some of the minerals used for wireless technology, have led and still are part of some of the greatest atrocities by way of genocide in places like Darfur and Sudan and some other regions throughout the world with those minerals. Become part of what's necessitated, and without policies to protect, right, then those injustices happen. So while we don't support cultural genocide by way of living in our very own existence, we do. Because again, we're not buying our own cloth. We're not getting together the night before we go to work on a sewing machine and saying, I got to make me some pants. I got to make me a shirt. I got to make me a hat to look nice for it to know. We buy these things in places that unfortunately implicate us. So that is also to say that at the end, how do we come to peace with the tensions of our humane inhumanities? You see what I'm saying? How do we allow ourselves to understand that there's some things we may not have control over, but that we could still be conscientious, mindful, thoughtful about in the way that we make decisions. And it's not to say that we're okay with injustices. It's simply to say that we live in a world where we got to understand how to implicate ourselves, but how to implicate ourselves alongside each other and amongst and with each other. So when we frame then diversity leadership or inclusive excellence now moving to the 21st century, this is not just about inclusion and excellence and diversity. This is about those last two bullet points in particular. It's about understanding the ways in which structures offer benefits for some groups that are very embedded in the organizational elements and mechanisms of that particular space, university or college. And it's not just about characteristics, it's also about processes, from design of curriculum to admissions, to hiring practices, to the way we evaluate, to the way that we allocate funding. Literally every day-to-day business decision has something to do with injustice, and we have to address it at that level, right? So an inclusive practitioner does exactly some of these things, right? An inclusive practitioner takes responsibility, such a key one. It's accountable, validates, affirms values in a very practical and real and explicit way, has courage, right? Has the ability to actually call something in with love, not call something out, to steal the words from Loretta Ross. Demonstrates humility, listens generously, listen to learn, as somebody said earlier, collaborates, and is not scared to enlist help or assistance, or a sense of at least inform me, not do it for me. Let's make that clear. Not, hey, I don't know how to do this, so I need you to do it, or can you do it for me? No, struggle with that. Cultivate trust is such an important piece. And when you think about this work in particular, then you start to think about what we need to know. So we need to not only acknowledge and move beyond, appearance, but we also want to assure that folks are heard and they're known. We want to be mindful of our own biases and how we bring those to our relationships, to our conversations, to the spaces that we fill. We got to understand that as a result of difference, people arrive to campus wounded with trauma. How do we assure we're attentive to that? How do we develop and cultivate a compassion for what many experience as internal terror? And how do we nurture that as a result of a lot of the things people are going to experience, to the point brought up earlier around imposter syndrome? It took me a while, and even when you look at research, what you find is that once people start to step into authenticity, and you could even find some of this in the work of Baxter Magdola around self-authorship in higher education, really starts to show that when you create a community where you honor authenticity, then you also start to see a transformation take place in how places become more inclusive. And so people know they're going to experience things, especially if you're from marginalized backgrounds, or if you have invisible identities like mental health or other issues that we're not attentive to, or somebody makes a comment about a veteran, For example, military veterans, if they don't have their gear, you don't know they're a military veteran. And so you have quite a bit of people then who kind of show up to spaces. And unless we're there with a sense of compassion, empathy, sympathy, and care and love, then we put ourselves in a position where we become dismissive and not attentive to the trauma that they bring to a relationship or to a space. So when you think about culturally, responsive practitioners, we need to be multi-dimensional because we have to be able to engage cultural knowledge, experiences, contributions, and perspectives. We have to be able to validate everybody, each other's, especially students' culture, and seek to bridge gaps between that misunderstanding and the inequities that bring students the way, in some ways, to our campuses and how they show up. We have to be responsive to social, emotional, and political comprehensiveness as we really try to seek to educate the entire person. We got to think about how to be transformative and with respect to how we view schools and societies and bring a critical lens. But more than anything else, cultural responsiveness is about emancipatory and liberatory praxis. It's about us being able to carve space for students to eventually feel like they could not only be them, but that they could thrive being them. That they could feel like they could own how they show up, where they show up, how they choose to engage or not engage, and that that's okay. So it's beyond awareness, understanding, and celebration. It's about advocacy. People always talk about cultural competence with awareness, understanding, and honoring in mind, but rarely, and that's the challenge I put out there to my peoples, to my friends, to my colleagues. Once we get beyond awareness, knowledge, and skills, what's next? It's advocacy. How do we take what we learned, the knowledge we have, the awareness that we've gained, and how do we use it to actually take action and advocate on behalf of marginalized communities and voices? And that starts with implicating self. There was a research study back in 2011 around academic advising through a social justice lens. And what Rouse found out through that study was that higher education became apparent that, in higher ed, we need practitioners who have the necessary skills to promote equity. Equity needs to be something that goes on annual performance evaluations. It should be an expectation in 2021. It should rise to that level of skill set where we tie it to expectations from our staff and our faculty. And yes, I say that here too. And a lot of faculty are down and some faculty push back, which is expected. We got to be able, right, when we think about our diverse students need empowered practitioners, advisors, and communities that understand the battles that they're facing and the ways in which they're fighting every day in different ways. And so Rouse kind of created a social justice model out of his dissertation that focuses on three pieces: critical awareness, transformation, and action. And I would suggest you actually, that's actually a solid dissertation. I don't say that about a lot of dissertations. I'm a very, Stephen knows, as a post-colonial cat and discourse, a sort of criticalist, I'm so like the idea of a done dissertation is a good dissertation. I get it, but I challenge that so much because I see so much recycled work, and I really want us to be able to move forward and advance the work, not necessarily recycle it. So what does at the end this begin to look like? A capacity for self-awareness and an ability to understand one's own beliefs. Just a consciousness of the dynamics inherent when people from different groups interact. And that includes knowing the role that power and culture play in humanity and society and the relationships that we aim to build. And really an appreciation and ability to adapt to varying intercultural communication and learning styles. How do we mix it up? one of the things I did when I taught, and I missed my classroom, but when I taught at Iowa, I was an adjunct professor there. And even at Puget Sound, I was a professor in the School of Education. I always left 20% of my syllabus open in terms of grades, and I worked with my students to build that 20%. I let them own 1/5 of the syllabus. I put the onus on them. I gave them the challenge, but I worked with them, mentored them so that the students can feel like they could create that. They could have interest. It's not just about what I'm offering, it's about the general subject matter and how they can also contribute to that space in a way where they also feel like they not only have something to bring, but what they have to bring is honored structurally. 1/5 of the syllabus was about students. It was like, what do y'all want to do? What are you interested in? Now, I had to make sure they were methodologically sound. It wasn't just like a whatever thing. It was still rigorous, but I stepped into that mentoring role and helping them understand how they can challenge themselves so they can grow and own that. And then, understand the value that that difference, offers. And so I'm going to close it and say, I leave you with this question, not to respond to it, but just in what ways do you currently contribute to equity in your respective role or spaces? Always a good question to have. And how can I meaningfully support colleagues grappling with that? At the end, here's one of my favorite quotes I want to leave you here in closing, and that is Paulo Freire. But everybody thinks about Pedagogy of the Oppressed. One of my favorite books is Pedagogy of Freedom, right? In which Paulo Freire says, the demand that is that right thinking belongs intimately to right doing. In this sense, to teach right thinking is not something that is simply spoken of or an experience that is merely described, but something that is done and lived while it is being spoken of, as if the doing and the living of it constituted a kind of irrefutable witness of its truth. So to all of you, thank you for trusting me. I appreciate you so much. And if you can just in one word, as we close, just one word, you can say as much as you want. I'm just saying one word, describe the last 2 hours here journeying with each other as a closing. That will be a great way to close. Appreciate you, Dr. Russ, my brother. Thank you for having me. To all of you, gratitude for trusting me with your time. Peace, peace, and much more peace. No, thank you. I appreciate all that commentary, and I'm glad that you're able to take away in that way.
Well, I just want to say, Dr. B, I was there till about 30 seconds ago, and then something happened. I got booted off. I just jumped back on. So I missed Paulo Freire's quote. So, but he's a favorite of mine, so I'm sure it was one that I'll appreciate. Just want to say thank you for joining us. We really appreciate you spending your time, talent, treasures with us, and investing in the Colorado Community College system as we're on our equity journey, doing our different work around the system at our 13 colleges, our system office, and our online department. So thank you, thank you, thank you. To everybody who's here, thank you for joining us with another for another month of Equity University. Our goal is to keep bringing you professional development opportunities, just opportunities to think about the work, to be a part of the work, and to just give you things to walk away from, reflect on, things to research and educate as you continue to do the work on your campuses, not only on behalf of yourselves, but on behalf of our students, so we can ensure that we reach our chancellor's goal of being the system where inequity doesn't exist and we're all thriving. So again, thank you guys so much. We are right on the top at 3 o'clock, so we kept you on time. Do me a favor and give me some fingers or a clap or whatever it is you want to do on your end for Dr. B. Thank you so much for being with us again. And we will see you next month, everyone. Thank you all so much.
Right on. Hey, dudes to all, Dr. Russ, me and you, we're going to link up here soon. And to everyone who's still on here, I'm a real accessible cat, man. You want to holler anytime, shoot me an email, say what's up, drop a note. get at me. Sometimes I'll be a little quick. Sometimes I may take a little longer, but I guarantee you I'm going to get back at you.
Right on.